What happens when a quiet neighborhood becomes the stage for a battle of resilience and redemption? Meet Clara, an 80-year-old gardener whose peaceful world is shattered by relentless acts of hate. But what her tormentors never expected is how their actions would backfire in ways they couldn't imagine. Witness courage, transformation, and the power of a community to rebuild together. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss future updates. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over Bloomstead, a quiet suburban town nestled in the heart of Alabama. Clara Johnson, an 80-year-old retired schoolteacher, stood in her garden, a vibrant mosaic of colors and textures. Roses in full bloom leaned gently against sturdy trellises. Sunflowers stretched their golden faces skyward, and lavender swayed in the breeze, releasing a calming aroma. Clara wiped her brow with the back of her hand, a smile lingering on her face as she admired her work. The garden wasn't just a place for flowers. It was a living testament to resilience. Each plant held a memory, some of joy, others of pain, but all spoke of a life well lived. Clara often said, "Gardening teaches patience. You can't rush growth. Each bloom knows its time." Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of laughter, sharp and mocking. Clara turned toward the noise and spotted a group of teenagers gathered near her fence. Josh Wilson, the eldest of the Wilson siblings, kicked a soccer ball deliberately into her yard. The ball barreled through a patch of daisies, snapping stems and scattering petals. The boys erupted into laughter as Josh leaned against the fence, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. Clara sighed, bending down to retrieve the ball. Her joints ached, but she moved with a dignity that belied her age. She walked to the fence, holding the ball in one hand. "Young man," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I'd appreciate it if you were more careful next time." Josh shrugged, his smirk widening. "It's just flowers, lady." Clara's eyes narrowed slightly. "They're more than just flowers," she said. "They're hard work and they deserve respect." For a brief moment, Josh's expression faltered, but it was quickly replaced with defiance. "Whatever," he muttered, turning to his friends. They sauntered off, their laughter echoing down the street. Clara returned to her garden, her hands trembling as she replanted the damaged daisies. A shadow of unease settled over her, but she refused to let it take root. Instead, she focused on her work, her fingers steadying as they dug into the soil. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara sat on her porch swing. The rhythmic creak of the chains was a soothing counterpoint to the chirping crickets. She watched the Wilson house across the street, its windows glowing faintly in the dim light. Clara had seen families like the Wilsons before, loud, brash, and full of unresolved tension. She noticed the youngest daughter, Maggie, peeking out from behind the curtains, her face a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Maggie reminded Clara of her younger self, quiet, observant, searching for a way to fit into a world that often felt too loud. Clara waved gently, but Maggie ducked out of sight. The peace of the night was shattered by a loud crash. Clara jolted upright, her heart pounding. She hurried to the side of the house where she found her wheelbarrow overturned and her tools scattered. Nearby, a soda can clinked against the pavement as it rolled to a stop. In the distance, she saw the boys disappearing into the shadows, their laughter trailing behind them like an unwelcome echo. Clara knelt to pick up her tools, her hands trembling, not from fear but from frustration. She had faced far worse in her lifetime: the sting of segregation, the weight of injustice, and the struggle for dignity in a world that often denied it. This was just another challenge, she told herself, another battle she would face with grace and determination. She stood, brushing the dirt from her hands, and whispered, "A garden grows stronger after the storm." That night, as Clara locked her doors and turned off the lights, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. She thought of Maggie, her timid face peering from the window, and wondered what kind of battles the young girl might be fighting in silence. The sound of a slammed door echoed through the Wilson household, shaking the thin walls of their modest suburban home. Ray Wilson, a wiry man in his late 40s, stood in the dimly lit kitchen, his jaw clenched and his fists gripping the edge of the counter. The faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound filling the tense air after the outburst. Upstairs, Maggie Wilson sat on her bed, her knees pulled to her chest. Her room was small, cluttered with school books and drawings she kept hidden from her father. Through the thin walls, she could hear her brother Josh laughing with his friends in his room, the sound grating like nails on a chalkboard. The laughter felt cruel, a stark contrast to the unease that had settled over Maggie ever since their encounter with Clara earlier that day. She thought of Clara's calm demeanor, the quiet strength in her voice as she defended her garden. Maggie admired it, but she also feared the consequences. Her father had always told them to stay away from people like Clara. Maggie had never questioned him aloud, but a knot of doubt had begun to tighten in her chest, especially as she watched Josh's antics grow bolder and meaner. Downstairs, Ray paced the kitchen, muttering under his breath. The weight of his frustration seemed to press against the walls. He had moved his family to Bloomstead 6 months ago, hoping for a fresh start after his wife's passing. But nothing felt fresh. The bills piled up, his job at the auto repair shop barely covered the necessities, and the tension with his children had only grown. "Josh!" Ray barked, his voice cutting through the house like a whip. Josh stomped down the stairs, his frame tall and lean but carrying the swagger of someone used to getting his way. "What?" he snapped, leaning against the doorframe. Ray glared at his son. "What's this I hear about you messing with that old woman's garden again?" Josh rolled his eyes. "It's just a stupid garden. Why do you even care?" Ray's fist slammed against the counter, making Maggie jump upstairs. "Because I said so. You think you can just do whatever you want? You think this world owes you something?" Josh stared at him, the defiance in his eyes flickering for a moment before returning. "It's not like she's going to do anything about it. Nobody cares." Ray stepped closer, his voice low and venomous. "Don't make me clean up your mess, boy. You've got no idea how this world works." For a brief moment, Josh wanted to ask his father what exactly he knew about the world, but he bit his tongue, the familiar fear creeping in. He turned and walked back upstairs, slamming his door shut behind him. Maggie flinched at the noise, her heart racing. She could feel the tension simmering in the house, threatening to boil over. She thought of the potted flowers she had taken from Clara's garden earlier in the week. It sat on her windowsill now, a fragile reminder of something better, something kinder. In the quiet of her room, Maggie whispered to herself, "Why does it always have to be like this?" Ray sat heavily at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. His memories drifted unbidden to his childhood, days spent under the harsh gaze of his own father, a man who had raised him with fists more often than words. Ray didn't know any other way to parent, but he hated how his anger mirrored his father's. He told himself he was just protecting his family, but deep down a small voice whispered, "Is this protection or control?" As the night wore on, the Wilson household grew silent, but the air remained thick with unspoken words and unresolved tension. Maggie lay awake, staring at the potted flower on her windowsill, its delicate petals catching the moonlight. She thought of Clara again, the way she had stood tall even as Josh sneered at her. Maggie wished she could find that kind of strength. Meanwhile, in his room, Josh stared at the ceiling. His friends had gone home hours ago, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He replayed the scene in Clara's garden, the look of disappointment on her face when she had spoken to him. For reasons he couldn't explain, it stuck with him. But his father's words echoed louder. "The world doesn't owe you anything." Josh shook his head, pushing the thoughts aside. Regret wasn't an option in his world. It was a weakness he couldn't afford. In the morning, the Wilson family would go through their routine. Ray yelling, Josh scoffing, Maggie retreating into silence. But underneath the surface, cracks were forming. And cracks left unattended always widened. The next morning in Bloomstead dawned heavy and gray, as if the sky itself bore the weight of the simmering tensions from the Wilson household. Maggie sat at the breakfast table, quietly nibbling on toast while Josh scrolled on his phone. Their father paced nearby, muttering about work schedules and unpaid bills. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. Josh glanced up from his phone, catching Maggie's nervous glance. He smirked, as if her unease fueled his defiance. "Guess I'll hang out with the guys later," he said, leaning back in his chair. Ray shot him a sharp look. "No trouble," he barked, his tone clipped. "I don't want to hear another word about that old woman across the street." Josh rolled his eyes but said nothing. He wasn't about to let his father dictate his every move. Not today. Later that evening, the boys gathered at the edge of Clara's property, their laughter low and conspiratorial. Josh held a can of spray paint in his hand, the metal rattling as he shook it. His friends egged him on, their taunts daring him to cross the line yet again. "This'll be good," one of them snickered, nudging Josh forward. Josh hesitated for a moment, his fingers tightening around the can. He could still see Clara's calm, steady gaze in his mind. Something about it had unnerved him. Her quiet dignity, her refusal to react with anger. But as his friends jeered, his pride won out. With a quick motion, he sprayed jagged, hateful words across the pristine white slats of Clara's fence. His heart pounded as the paint flowed, the letters forming crude insults meant to sting. The boys erupted into laughter as Josh stepped back, a mixture of adrenaline and guilt coursing through him. When they left, the fence bore the ugly scars of their actions, and the once quiet street felt tainted by the weight of their cruelty. The next morning, Clara emerged from her home to find the vandalism. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the slurs scrawled across her fence. For a moment, she stood still, the insult heavy in the morning air. But then, as always, she steadied herself. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed a bucket of soapy water and a brush, her movements deliberate as she began scrubbing the paint away. As she worked, a shadow fell over her. Looking up, she saw her neighbor Evelyn standing hesitantly at the edge of the yard. Evelyn's eyes darted to the fence, then back to Clara. "Do you need help?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara paused, her hands resting on the brush. "I won't say no," she replied, her voice calm but tinged with gratitude. Together, the two women worked in silence, the rhythmic scrubbing a quiet act of defiance against the hatred that had crept into their neighborhood. Clara's strength inspired Evelyn, who had spent too long looking the other way. Across the street, Maggie watched from her bedroom window. She wanted to help, but fear held her back. She felt trapped between the hostility of her family and the quiet courage she saw in Clara. That evening, Clara's resolve was tested yet again. Josh and his friends returned, emboldened by the lack of consequences for their actions. This time they hurled soda cans and rocks over the fence, laughing as the projectiles scattered through the garden. Clara stepped onto her porch, her hands on her hips, her eyes locking on Josh. "Enough!" she called out, her voice steady and commanding. The boys froze for a moment, startled by her tone, but Josh recovered quickly, his smirk returning. "What are you going to do, lady?" he taunted. "Call the cops?" Clara didn't answer. Instead, she held her ground, her gaze unwavering. It was a battle of wills, and Josh was the first to break eye contact. With a muttered curse, he grabbed his friends and left, their laughter fading into the night. As Clara picked up the debris littering her yard, she felt the familiar ache of exhaustion creeping into her bones, but she refused to let it consume her. "A strong garden survives storms," she whispered to herself, repeating the mantra that had carried her through so many challenges. Later that night, as Maggie lay in bed, she couldn't shake the image of Clara standing on her porch, unyielding in the face of Josh's taunts. For the first time, Maggie felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in years: hope. She reached for the small potted flower she had taken from Clara's garden days earlier. Its leaves were still vibrant, its roots steady despite its relocation. Maggie placed it on her nightstand, staring at it for a long moment before whispering, "Maybe it's time to plant something new." Unbeknownst to Maggie, her quiet rebellion would soon grow into something much larger, something that would challenge the walls her father and brother had built around their hearts. The sun rose over Bloomstead, casting a pale golden light on Clara's battered garden. Though the morning was quiet, the scars left behind by Josh and his friends still marked the yard. Broken stems and scattered petals littered the ground, while Clara's fence, though scrubbed clean, bore faint stains from the hateful graffiti. Clara sipped her coffee on the porch, her hands steady despite the ache in her fingers. The rhythmic chirping of birds was a comforting backdrop as she reflected on the previous night. She knew the boys would return, But she also knew she couldn't face this battle alone. Across the street, Maggie sat at her bedroom window, the potted flower from Clara's garden still resting on her nightstand. She had watched Clara's quiet defiance and Evelyn's small act of courage. The guilt weighing on Maggie's chest grew heavier with each passing moment. She wanted to help, but the shadow of her father's anger loomed large. That afternoon, Clara received an unexpected visitor. Caleb Green, a young volunteer from the local community center, walked up her driveway with hesitant steps. Caleb was in his mid-20s, a kind-hearted man with an easy smile. His grandmother had been one of Clara's students years ago, and her stories of Clara's strength had left a lasting impression on him. "Miss Clara," Caleb said, tipping his cap, "I heard about what's been happening, and I wanted to see if I could help." Clara raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Help, you say? Do you know anything about gardening?" "Not much," Caleb admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "But I'm good with tools, and I can follow directions." Clara nodded, appreciating his sincerity. She handed him a pair of gloves and guided him to the damaged flower beds. Together they worked in companionable silence, Clara instructing Caleb on how to trim broken stems and replant uprooted flowers. As they worked, Clara shared snippets of her life, her voice steady and calm. "This garden's seen worse days," she said. "I've lived through storms, real ones and the kind that test your soul. But the thing about storms is, they pass. And when they do, you rebuild." Caleb listened intently, inspired by Clara's quiet wisdom. "You've got more patience than most people I know," he said. "Not sure I'd handle this so calmly." Clara chuckled softly. "Patience isn't something you're born with, Caleb. It's something you learn when life gives you no other choice." Across the street, Maggie watched from her window, her heart pounding as she saw Caleb helping Clara. The sight filled her with a mix of hope and fear. If a stranger could stand with Clara, maybe Maggie could too, but the thought of her father's wrath kept her rooted in place. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Maggie finally found the courage to act. She slipped out of the house, clutching a small note she had written earlier. In it, she apologized for her brother's actions and offered to help in any way she could. Her hands trembled as she placed the note on Clara's porch and knocked lightly before hurrying away into the shadows. Clara opened the door, startled by the sound. She spotted the folded paper resting on the porch swing and picked it up, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was shaky, but the words were heartfelt. Clara smiled faintly, her gaze drifting toward the Wilson house. She didn't know who had written the note, but the gesture gave her hope. Meanwhile, back at the Wilson household, tensions continued to simmer. Ray noticed Maggie's absence and confronted her as soon as she returned. "Where were you?" he demanded, his voice low and sharp. "Nowhere," Maggie replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She avoided his gaze, clutching her hands tightly to keep them from shaking. Ray leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "You're not sneaking off to talk to that woman, are you?" Maggie shook her head quickly. "No, I was just out for some air." Ray studied her for a moment before stepping back, his expression hard. "Good. Don't get any ideas about sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Upstairs, Josh heard the exchange and frowned. He hadn't missed the way Maggie had been looking at Clara's garden lately. He didn't understand why she cared so much, but something about her quiet defiance unsettled him. For the first time, he wondered if he'd gone too far. The next day, Clara noticed Maggie lingering near the edge of her yard, her small frame tense as she hesitated to approach. Clara waved gently, her expression warm and inviting. After a moment, Maggie stepped forward, her shoulders hunched as if expecting to be scolded. I'm sorry about what happened," Maggie stammered, her eyes fixed on the ground. "I didn't mean for things to get so bad." Clara's gaze softened. She knelt down, meeting Maggie's eyes. "It takes courage to apologize," she said gently, "but it takes even more courage to stand up for what's right. You've got that courage, Maggie. I can see it." Maggie's eyes welled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. "I don't know how to stop them," she whispered. "They don't listen to me." Clara placed a comforting hand on Maggie's shoulder. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said. "But it starts with one small act, one person willing to do what's right." As Maggie left, a new resolve began to take shape within her. She wasn't sure how, but she knew she had to find a way to make things right. Not just for Clara, but for herself. The days after Maggie's quiet apology brought a fragile sense of hope to Clara's battered garden. Though the flowers still bore the scars of vandalism, Clara could feel a shift, a faint ripple of change that began with Maggie's trembling words. Yet beneath this hope, Clara remained wary. She had lived long enough to know that change was rarely linear. It came with resistance, often in its most destructive form. It was a humid evening when Clara's fears proved true. She had just finished watering her flowers and was wiping her hands on her apron when the sound of crackling firecrackers split the air. The noise startled her, but it was the acrid smell of smoke that truly set her on edge. She hurried toward the source and saw a small patch of her garden ablaze, the flames licking at the edges of her marigolds. Beyond the fire, shadows darted. Josh and his friends, their laughter carried on the night air as they disappeared into the darkness. Clara didn't panic. Instead, she acted with the precision of someone who had faced many crises in her life. Grabbing a bucket of water she kept nearby, she doused the flames before they could spread further. Her hands trembled as she worked, not from fear, but from the anger bubbling just beneath her calm exterior. Across the street, Maggie watched the scene unfold from her bedroom window, her breath caught in her throat. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. This wasn't just childish mischief anymore. This was cruelty, plain and simple. The next morning, Clara called the police. Officer Ben Morales arrived within the hour, his expression a mix of concern and frustration. He was a young man, new to the Bloomstead force, and had already become familiar with Clara's quiet resilience. "This is getting out of hand," Clara said, her voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. She gestured toward the scorched patch of her garden. "This isn't just vandalism anymore, Officer Morales. This is intimidation." Morales nodded, his brow furrowed. "I agree, Miss Clara, but without concrete evidence, witnesses, video footage, it's hard to press charges. Have you thought about installing cameras?" Clara sighed, folding her arms across her chest. "So, until I provide proof, I'm just supposed to endure this?" Morales shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'll do what I can to keep an eye on things, but—" He hesitated, then added quietly, "People like Josh, they act out because they think they can get away with it. Sometimes they need to see consequences to understand." After Morales left, Clara stood in her garden, her hands resting on her hips as she surveyed the damage. Her neighbor Evelyn came over, her steps hesitant but determined. "I saw what happened last night," Evelyn admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to come out and help, but—" Clara turned to her, her gaze softening. "It's not easy to stand up," she said gently. "But when we don't, we let them win." Evelyn nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I'm ready now. Just tell me what I can do." Together they began to clean up the mess, Clara's quiet strength bolstering Evelyn's resolve. Across the street, Maggie watched them, her stomach churning with guilt. She knew she couldn't stay silent anymore. That evening, Maggie confronted her brother. She found him in the garage with his friends, laughing and bragging about the firecrackers. Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to speak. "You need to stop," she said, her words slicing through the laughter. "What you're doing to Miss Clara, it's not right." Josh turned to her, his smirk fading into a scowl. "Mind your own business, Maggie." "This is my business," she shot back, surprising even herself with her boldness. "She didn't do anything to you, Josh. You're just hurting her because you can." Josh's friends exchanged uneasy glances, the tension in the room thickening. One of them muttered, "She's got a point, man." Josh's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped, but there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice. Maggie held her ground, her gaze unwavering. Later that night, Josh sat alone in his room, the weight of Maggie's words pressing down on him. He replayed the events in his mind, the firecrackers, the graffiti, the way Clara had stood on her porch, unyielding even in the face of their taunts. For the first time, he felt something crack inside him, a small but undeniable pang of guilt. Meanwhile, Maggie couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, her mind racing. She thought of Clara, of her gentle words and unshakable resolve. She thought of her father, his anger a constant presence in their lives, and she thought of Josh, trapped in a cycle he didn't know how to break. The next morning, Maggie made a decision. She slipped out of the house and walked to Clara's porch, her heart pounding. She carried a small potted plant, a marigold she had replanted the night before. It was a fragile offering, but it was all she had. When Clara opened the door, she looked at Maggie with a mixture of surprise and warmth. "Good morning," she said, her tone inviting. Maggie held out the pot, her hands trembling. I wanted to give this to you," she said. "I know it doesn't fix what they did, but—" Clara took the plant, her expression softening. "Thank you, Maggie," she said, her voice steady. "It means more than you know." As Maggie turned to leave, Clara called after her. "Maggie," she said, her tone firm but kind. "You have more power than you think. Don't be afraid to use it." Maggie nodded, her resolve strengthening. For the first time, she felt a spark of hope, not just for Clara's garden, but for herself. Maggie's quiet act of kindness toward Clara was a small but meaningful step in the right direction. Yet the larger battle still loomed. Clara knew that her stand against the Wilson boys and the larger forces of apathy in her neighborhood was far from over. That morning, as she sat on her porch with a steaming cup of tea, she reflected on how the seeds of division had been sown not just by those who acted with malice, but by those who chose to stay silent. Her thoughts were interrupted by Evelyn Crane's hesitant knock at her gate. "Clara," Evelyn called softly, "do you have a moment?" Clara gestured for Evelyn to come closer, her expression warm despite the weight on her mind. Evelyn approached, her face drawn with worry. "I've been thinking," Evelyn began, her voice trembling slightly, "about what you said, that when we stay silent, we let them win. You're right, I don't want to stay silent anymore." Clara smiled faintly and motioned for Evelyn to sit beside her on the porch swing. "It's not easy to speak up," Clara said gently, "but it's the only way things change." Evelyn nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. "I want to help, Clara. Whatever you need, I'm here." That afternoon, Clara and Evelyn began planning a neighborhood meeting. They knocked on doors, spoke to neighbors, and handed out flyers, urging everyone to come together to address the recent events. While some responded with encouragement, others were hesitant, their fear of confrontation holding them back. "I don't want any trouble," said Mr. Ramirez, an elderly man who lived 2 doors down. "Those boys are reckless. Who's to say they won't come after me next?" Clara placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Trouble finds us whether we stand up or not," she said. "But standing together, that's how we show them we won't be intimidated." By evening, a small but determined group had gathered in Clara's living room. The room was a mix of longtime residents like Evelyn and newcomers like the Hernandez family, who had recently moved in with their 2 young children. Caleb Green sat near the door, his presence a quiet symbol of support. "Thank you all for coming," Clara began, her voice calm but resolute. "I know this isn't easy. Speaking out against wrongs rarely is. But this isn't just about my garden. It's about the kind of community we want to live in." She paused, letting her words sink in. "When we stay silent in the face of hate, we allow it to grow. But when we stand together, we show that hate has no place here." The room was quiet, the weight of Clara's words settling over the group. Evelyn spoke next, her voice shaking but clear. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years, she said, "and I've never seen anything like this. But Clara's right. We can't let fear control us. We have to show those boys and their father that this community won't tolerate this behavior." As the group discussed possible actions, the mood shifted from hesitance to determination. Caleb suggested organizing a community watch to deter further vandalism, while Mrs. Hernandez offered to help repaint Clara's fence. The group agreed to draft a letter addressing the Wilson family directly, signed by everyone present. That night, Clara sat on her porch, reflecting on the day's progress. Though the meeting was small, it felt like the beginning of something important, a turning point for Bloomstead. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. Across the street, Maggie watched the flickering light from Clara's porch and felt a mix of pride and apprehension. She knew her father wouldn't take kindly to the neighborhood's newfound unity. That fear was confirmed the next morning when Ray Wilson found the letter on his doorstep. The letter was firm, but respectful, outlining the community's concerns about Josh's behavior and urging Ray to take responsibility as a parent. Ray's face darkened as he read it, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Josh!" he barked, slamming the letter onto the kitchen table. "Get down here!" Josh appeared moments later, his expression wary. "What's your problem now?" he muttered. Ray thrust the letter at him. "This is what happens when you don't know how to behave," he snapped. "You embarrass this family. You embarrass me." Josh's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Maggie watched the exchange from the doorway, her heart pounding. She wanted to speak up, to defend Clara and the neighbors who had finally found their voices, but fear held her back. That evening, as the sun set over Bloomstead, Clara noticed Ray standing at his front door watching her. His gaze was hard, his posture rigid, but he didn't approach. Clara met his stare calmly, refusing to be intimidated. The next few days were tense. Some neighbors who had signed the letter began to second-guess their decision, worried about retaliation. Others grew more resolute, their determination fueled by Clara's example. The divide in the community became more apparent with each passing day. Those who stood with Clara felt a growing sense of solidarity, while those who remained silent grappled with their own fear and guilt. For Clara, the fight was no longer just about her garden. It was about showing Bloomstead what courage could accomplish. And while the path forward remained uncertain, she was determined to see it through. The tension in Bloomstead was palpable after the letter to Ray Wilson. Clara had anticipated resistance, but the quiet hostility radiating from the Wilson house was heavier than she expected. Every time she stepped into her garden, she felt the weight of eyes on her, watching, judging, waiting for her to falter. Across the street, Maggie sat at her bedroom window, her gaze fixed on Clara. The small marigold she had gifted now stood proudly in Clara's garden, a bright splash of yellow against the battered flower beds. Maggie felt a flicker of pride, but it was quickly overshadowed by fear. She had overheard her father ranting about the letter, his anger directed not just at the neighbors, but at her. Downstairs, Josh slouched on the couch, flipping through TV channels with a blank expression. The tension in the house had seeped into his skin, leaving him restless and irritable. His friends had stopped coming around as often, unsettled by the growing backlash in the neighborhood. Even Josh was beginning to feel the weight of it all. The angry stares from neighbors, the disappointed looks from Maggie, and the guilt that gnawed at the edges of his defiance. That night, Josh found himself wandering the streets of Bloomstead, his thoughts a jumbled mess. He ended up near Clara's garden, the moonlight casting long shadows over the yard. He stood there for a long moment, his hands shoved deep into his pockets before finally stepping closer. The marigold caught his eye, its delicate petals swaying gently in the night breeze. Josh crouched down, running his fingers over the petals. They felt fragile yet resilient, much like the woman who had planted them. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the weight of what he had done, the damage he had caused, the pain he had inflicted. It wasn't just a garden. It was someone's sanctuary, someone's life. "Josh?" a voice called softly, startling him. He turned to see Maggie standing a few feet away, her expression a mix of surprise and concern. "What are you doing here?" she whispered. Josh straightened, his defenses snapping back into place. "None of your business," he muttered. Maggie stepped closer, her voice firm despite her nerves. "You shouldn't be here if you're just going to make things worse." Josh looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the same determination in her eyes that he had seen in Clara's. It unsettled him. "I wasn't doing anything," he said, his tone quieter this time. "I was just thinking." Maggie hesitated before speaking again. "You don't have to keep doing this, Josh. It's not too late to make things right." Josh scoffed, but the words hit him harder than he let on. "You don't get it, Maggie. Dad, he'll never let me stop. He'll never let me change." Maggie's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. "You're not him, Josh. You can choose to be better." Josh didn't respond. He turned and walked away, leaving Maggie standing in the shadows, her heart heavy with both hope and sorrow. The next day, Clara noticed something unusual. A small note had been slipped under her porch door. She opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the shaky handwriting. "I'm sorry for what I've done. I don't know how to fix it, but I want to try." Clara stared at the note for a long time, her heart aching for the boy who had written it. She knew it was Josh, and though she had every reason to be angry, all she felt was a quiet hope. She folded the note carefully and tucked it into her pocket. Later that afternoon, Clara stood in her garden, tending to the marigold Maggie had brought her. Evelyn joined her, carrying a tray of lemonade. "You've got a visitor," Evelyn said, nodding toward the gate. Clara turned to see Maggie standing there, clutching another small plant in her hands. Clara smiled warmly and motioned for her to come in. Maggie hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to stop her before stepping inside. I brought this," Maggie said, holding out the plant. It was a small lavender sprig, its roots wrapped in damp cloth. "I thought it might look nice here." Clara accepted the plant, her smile deepening. "It's beautiful, Maggie. Thank you." As they worked together to plant the lavender, Clara spoke gently. "You have a good heart, Maggie. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Maggie blinked back tears, her hands steady as she pressed the soil around the plant. "I just wish I could do more," she whispered. "You've already done more than you know," Clara replied. "Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness have the biggest impact." That evening, Maggie returned home to find Josh sitting on the porch steps, his head in his hands. She sat beside him, neither of them speaking for a long time. Finally, Josh broke the silence. "I don't know how to stop," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's like every time I try, I just mess up more." Maggie placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch light but steady. "You just took the first step, Josh. That's all anyone can do." For the first time in a long time, Josh allowed himself to hope. He didn't know what the future held, but for now, he was willing to try. The fragile truce in the Wilson household after Josh's quiet moment of reflection felt like walking on cracked ice. Maggie's words lingered in his mind, a mix of comfort and challenge, while Clara's steadfast presence loomed large in his thoughts. The note he left on Clara's porch had been his first step toward making amends, but he knew it was only the beginning. Change, as Maggie had said, required more than just words. The neighborhood, however, remained tense. Clara's garden had become a symbol of defiance and resilience, but not everyone in Bloomstead saw it that way. The few neighbors who had supported Clara now found themselves on edge, fearing retaliation from the Wilson family or further acts of vandalism. The divide between action and apathy grew wider with every passing day. Clara, meanwhile, continued her quiet work. She knew better than anyone that change wasn't quick or easy. Her days were spent tending to her garden, her nights drafting letters and petitions, urging her neighbors to take a stand. Evelyn remained by her side, her newfound courage bolstered by Clara's steady resolve. One afternoon, as Clara was painting over the last remnants of graffiti on her fence, Officer Morales pulled into her driveway. He stepped out of the patrol car, his face lined with concern. "Miss Clara," he began, removing his hat, "I've been hearing things around town. Some folks are worried this situation is escalating." Clara set her paintbrush down and wiped her hands on a rag. "Officer Morales, this situation escalated the moment they decided my garden was a target. I won't let fear stop me from standing my ground." Morales nodded, though the weight of his role was evident in his posture. "Just be careful," he said. "Sometimes standing up for what's right makes you a bigger target." Clara met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "I've been a target before, officer. This isn't new to me." The officer hesitated, then said, "We're holding a town meeting tomorrow night. It might be a good place to address some of these issues publicly." Clara thanked him, and as he drove away, she turned her attention back to her fence. The idea of speaking at the town meeting filled her with equal parts determination and dread. She had always preferred action over words, but she knew this was a chance to make her voice heard. When the night of the meeting arrived, the community center buzzed with quiet tension. Clara entered the room with Evelyn by her side, her chin held high despite the murmurs that followed her. She saw Ray Wilson standing near the back, his arms crossed and his jaw set. Josh and Maggie sat a few rows ahead of him, their expressions unreadable. When Clara's turn to speak came, she stepped to the front of the room, her hands clasped in front of her. She took a deep breath and began. "Good evening," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "My name is Clara Johnson. Many of you know me as the woman with the garden on Maple Street, but I'm more than that. I'm a mother, a teacher, and a neighbor, just like all of you." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Over the past few weeks, my garden has been vandalized. My property has been targeted, and I've been made to feel unwelcome in a place I've called home for decades. But this isn't just about a garden. It's about respect. It's about community, and it's about standing against hate." Ray shifted uncomfortably in the back of the room, his scowl deepening. Josh stared at the floor, his hands clenched into fists. Clara continued. "We teach our children to take responsibility for their actions. We teach them that words and deeds matter. But what happens when the adults in their lives don't lead by example? What kind of community are we building if we allow hatred to take root?" The room was silent, the weight of Clara's words hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Ray spoke, his voice sharp and defensive. "So what? You're blaming my kids for everything wrong in this neighborhood?" Clara turned to him, her expression calm but firm. "I'm saying we're all responsible for the example we set. Hate isn't born, it's taught, and it's up to us to unteach it." Ray opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Josh stood up. His voice was quiet but clear. "She's right," he said, his eyes on Clara. "I've done a lot of things I'm not proud of, and I'm sorry." The room erupted in murmurs, Ray's face turning red with anger. "Josh, sit down," he growled, but Josh didn't move. He turned to face his father, his voice trembling but resolute. "No, Dad, this isn't about you, it's about me, and I don't want to be like this anymore." Maggie stood as well, her small frame radiating strength. "Me neither," she said. "It's time for us to do better." Ray looked at his children, his jaw tightening as he struggled to maintain control. Finally, he turned and stormed out of the room, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Clara stepped down from the podium, her heart heavy but hopeful. She placed a hand on Josh's shoulder as she passed him, her touch light but reassuring. "It's never too late to start," she said softly. That night, as Clara sat on her porch, she reflected on the events of the meeting. The cracks in the wall of hate and fear had begun to form. It would take time and effort to break it down completely, but for the first time in weeks, Clara felt the tide beginning to turn. The aftermath of the town meeting sent ripples through Bloomstead. Clara's speech had struck a chord with some and a nerve with others, but the most surprising moment had come from Josh and Maggie. Their public stand against their father had been unexpected, even for Clara. Yet the confrontation with Ray had left an air of unease that Clara knew wouldn't dissipate easily. The following days were quiet, almost unnervingly so. Clara continued her routine, tending to her garden with careful hands while the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Across the street, Maggie and Josh kept their distance from their father, the tension in the Wilson household growing thicker with every passing hour. It was on a stormy evening, the skies gray and foreboding, that the fragile peace shattered. Clara was in her kitchen brewing a pot of tea when she heard shouting from across the street. She moved to the window and saw Ray standing on his porch, his voice loud and slurred, a bottle clutched in his hand. The rain fell in heavy sheets, but it did nothing to dampen his anger. "I don't need anyone telling me how to raise my kids," Ray bellowed, his words directed at no one and everyone. "This is my house, my family." Clara's stomach tightened as she watched. She could see Maggie and Josh peeking through the curtains, their faces pale with fear. Without thinking, Clara grabbed her raincoat and stepped out into the storm. By the time she reached the Wilson yard, several neighbors had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Evelyn was among them, her face a mix of worry and determination. Clara raised a hand to silence the murmurs before stepping closer to Ray. "Ray," she called, her voice firm but calm. "That's enough." Ray turned to her, his eyes bloodshot and wild. "Oh, it's you," he spat. "The great Clara Johnson, always telling people what to do." "I'm not here to tell you anything," Clara replied, her tone steady despite the pounding of her heart. I'm here because your children deserve better than this. Ray laughed bitterly, the sound cutting through the rain. My children? You don't know anything about my family, lady. Clara stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. I know they're scared of you. I know they're trying to be better, despite everything you've taught them. And I know you're angry, but that anger doesn't have to define you. Ray's face twisted with rage. He took a step toward Clara, but Josh burst through the door before he could get any closer. Stop! Josh shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. Just stop, Dad! Ray froze, the rain dripping from his hair as he stared at his son. Josh's hands were clenched at his sides, his body trembling, but his voice was steady as he continued. I'm done with this. I'm done hurting people just because you think it makes us strong. Ray's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Behind Josh, Maggie stepped onto the porch, her small frame dwarfed by the storm, but her presence no less powerful. We're not you, Dad, she said, her voice soft but resolute. We don't have to live like this. The silence that followed was deafening. The neighbors watched, their breath held as they waited for Ray's response. For a moment, it seemed as though he might lash out again, but then his shoulders slumped, the fight draining from his posture. You don't understand, he muttered, his voice barely audible over the rain. You don't know what it's like to lose everything. Clara stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. No, Ray, I don't. But I do know that holding on to hate only makes the pain worse. You've lost enough. Don't lose them too. Ray looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time, his anger seemed to falter, replaced by something closer to sorrow. He dropped the bottle, the glass shattering against the wet concrete, and turned back toward the house without another word. As the storm began to lighten, the neighbors slowly dispersed, their murmurs fading into the night. Clara stayed for a moment longer, her gaze lingering on the Wilson house. She didn't know if Ray would change, but for now the first crack in his armor had appeared. Back in her own home, Clara dried off and sat by the window with her tea. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and the air felt lighter, as if the storm had washed away some of the tension that had gripped the neighborhood. She thought of Josh and Maggie, their courage in the face of their father's wrath, and felt a deep sense of hope. The fight wasn't over, but tonight had been a turning point. For the first time, Clara felt that the roots of change had taken hold, and with time, they might grow into something strong and lasting. The morning after the storm felt different in Bloomstead. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of rain-soaked earth. Clara stood on her porch, gazing at her garden, which had endured its share of destruction over the past weeks. The marigold Maggie had planted stood resilient amidst the battered flower beds, a quiet reminder of hope. The events of the previous night replayed in Clara's mind, the confrontation with Ray, the courage of Josh and Maggie, and the small but significant crack in Ray's armor. Clara knew that change wouldn't come overnight, but the seeds had been planted. Now it was time to nurture them. A knock at her gate drew Clara's attention. She turned to see Evelyn standing there, a paintbrush and a can of white paint in her hands. Behind her were Caleb Green and a few other neighbors, carrying gardening tools, pots of soil, and trays of flowers. We thought we'd lend a hand, Evelyn said, her voice strong despite the slight tremble in her hands. Clara's heart swelled with gratitude. She opened the gate and welcomed them in, her smile as warm as the morning sun. Thank you, she said softly. This means more than you know. The group got to work immediately. Caleb and another young neighbor began repairing the damaged fence, while Evelyn and Clara worked on replanting the flower beds. Mrs. Hernandez arrived with her 2 children, who eagerly helped water the newly planted flowers. Even Officer Morales stopped by during his patrol, offering to carry bags of soil and lend his support. As they worked, the atmosphere was filled with a sense of camaraderie that had been absent in Bloomstead for far too long. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves now exchanged stories and laughter, their shared effort building a sense of unity. Maggie and Josh arrived later that morning, carrying a small tree sapling between them. Maggie's face was bright with determination, while Josh seemed more subdued but no less committed. "We brought this," Maggie said, holding the sapling up proudly. "We thought it could go right in the middle of the garden." Clara nodded, her smile widening. "A tree is a perfect choice," she said. "Its roots will grow deep, just like the strength we found here." Josh helped Caleb dig the hole for the tree, his movements deliberate and focused. As they worked, Clara approached him, her voice quiet but firm. "Josh, what you're doing today, it matters, not just for the garden, but for the kind of man you want to be." Josh paused, looking up at her. I don't want to be like him," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to be," Clara replied. "The choices you make now define who you are, not the mistakes of the past." When the tree was planted, the group gathered around it, admiring their work. The once damaged garden now looked vibrant and alive, each flower and plant a symbol of resilience and renewal. The tree stood tall in the center, its delicate branches reaching skyward as if seeking light. As the day wore on, neighbors who had hesitated to get involved began to stop by, their curiosity turning into a desire to contribute. Some brought food and drinks for the workers, while others picked up tools and joined in the effort. By evening, the garden had become a hub of activity, a testament to the power of community. Ray Wilson watched from his porch, his face unreadable. He saw his children laughing and working alongside Clara and the neighbors, their spirits lighter than he had seen in years. Something stirred within him, a mix of pride, shame, and longing. As the sun set, Ray approached the garden, his steps hesitant but purposeful. He carried a small potted plant, its leaves green and full of promise. Clara looked up as he approached, her expression calm but expectant. "I thought this might fit," Ray said gruffly, holding out the plant. Clara took it, her hand steady. "It will," she said simply, her voice carrying no judgment, only acceptance. Ray stood there for a moment, his gaze on the tree in the center of the garden. "You've got a lot of patience," he muttered, "more than I deserve." "Patience comes from practice," Clara replied, "and there's always room to grow." Ray nodded, then turned and walked back to his house. Clara watched him go, a small smile playing on her lips. The journey ahead for him, and for Bloomstead, was far from over, but this was a start. As the garden quieted and the neighbors began to disperse, Clara sat on her porch swing, looking out over the transformed yard. The marigolds swayed gently in the breeze, the lavender stood tall and fragrant, and the tree sapling cast a long shadow in the fading light. Clara's heart was full as she whispered to herself, "A garden isn't just a place. It's a promise to grow, to heal, to hope, to heal, to—" The newly restored garden stood as a beacon in Bloomstead, its vibrant flowers and the young tree at its center a living testament to the power of resilience and unity. Over the next few weeks, the ripple effects of the garden's renewal began to spread throughout the neighborhood. Clara noticed small but significant changes. Neighbors who had once hurried past her house with their heads down now stopped to admire the garden. Some brought their children, pointing out the marigolds, lavender, and the tree as symbols of growth and strength. For Clara, these moments were victories, proof that the seeds of change she had planted were taking root. One morning, as Clara watered the flowers, Caleb Green arrived with a group of teenagers from the community center. They carried shovels, gardening gloves, and potted plants. Caleb explained, "We've started a project inspired by your garden. The kids wanted to plant something meaningful at the center to remind them that even when life gets tough, things can grow." Clara's eyes glistened as she welcomed the group into her yard. Together, they worked to plant a bed of wildflowers along the edge of the fence, each bloom chosen for its ability to thrive in harsh conditions. As they worked, Clara shared stories from her past, tales of struggle, perseverance, and the importance of standing together. One of the teenagers, a shy girl named Lila, asked quietly, "Miss Clara, how do you stay so strong when people hurt you?" Clara paused, her hands resting on the soil. "Strength doesn't mean you don't feel the hurt," she said gently. "It means you keep going anyway. And sometimes the best way to find strength is to help others grow." Meanwhile, Maggie and Josh continued to grow closer to Clara. They often stopped by after school, helping her tend to the garden or simply sitting on the porch to talk. Maggie's bright curiosity brought laughter to Clara's days, while Josh's quiet determination showed a young man trying to rebuild himself, piece by piece. One afternoon, as Josh worked to repair a section of the fence, he looked up at Clara and asked, "Do you think it's really possible to change, to fix all the things I've done wrong?" Clara rested a hand on his shoulder, her voice steady and kind. "Change isn't about erasing the past, Josh. It's about learning from it and choosing to do better every day. You're already on that path." Across the street, Ray Wilson watched his children from the porch, his face a mixture of pride and uncertainty. He had begun to soften in small ways, fixing the loose hinge on Maggie's door, asking Josh about his day, but his guilt and anger still weighed heavily on him. Clara could see that his journey would be long, but she believed in the potential for growth, no matter how slow. The garden's influence began to reach beyond Clara's yard. Evelyn Crane, emboldened by her experiences, organized a neighborhood cleanup day, bringing together residents who had once kept to themselves. The event transformed Bloomstead streets and fostered a sense of community that had been missing for years. At the same time, the Hernandez family started a community potluck, inviting neighbors to share food and stories. Clara brought a basket of freshly picked tomatoes from her garden, and the sight of neighbors laughing and connecting filled her heart with hope. Even Officer Morales noticed a shift in the town. Calls about minor disputes and vandalism decreased, replaced by reports of neighbors helping one another. On his next patrol, he stopped by Clara's house and said, "It's like you've started a revolution here, Miss Clara. You've got everyone looking out for each other." Clara smiled. "It's not my revolution, officer. It's ours." As the weeks turned into months, the garden continued to flourish, its roots growing deeper with every passing day. The tree at its center stood taller now, its branches stretching toward the sky. For Clara, it was more than just a tree. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when people chose hope over fear, unity over division. Maggie and Josh spent more time in the garden, their laughter a soothing melody that filled Clara's days. Josh even began volunteering at the community center, following Caleb's example and helping younger kids find their footing. Maggie, inspired by Clara's wisdom, started a school project on community resilience, using the garden as her centerpiece. One evening, as Clara sat on her porch with a cup of tea, she watched the sunset paint the garden in shades of gold and orange. She thought of the journey that had brought her to this moment, the pain, the struggle, and the triumphs. Her heart swelled with gratitude, not just for what the garden had become, but for the people who had helped nurture it. "A garden grows with care," Clara whispered to herself, "and so does a community." A year had passed since the garden's transformation, and Bloomstead was no longer the fractured community it once was. The garden, once a target for anger and division, had become a symbol of hope, resilience, and the power of change. Its vibrant colors and the strong tree at its center now served as a gathering place for neighbors, a reminder of what they had overcome together. On a warm summer evening, Clara sat on her porch swing, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in hues of gold and purple. The evening air buzzed with the laughter of children and the soft hum of conversation. The neighborhood had come alive in ways Clara had never thought possible. She set her tea down and stood, her steps slow but steady as she made her way to the garden. A small crowd had gathered there, a mix of familiar faces and new ones. Evelyn Crane stood near the fence, chatting with Caleb Green, who had brought another group of teenagers from the community center to admire the garden. The Hernandez children ran through the pathways, their laughter ringing like bells. At the center of it all were Josh and Maggie. Josh was helping a young boy plant a marigold, his hands guiding the child's small fingers with care. Maggie sat near the tree, her notebook open on her lap, sketching the scene with a look of quiet concentration. Clara reached the center of the garden, and the group quieted as they noticed her presence. She smiled, the kind of smile that carried years of wisdom and gratitude. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steady and warm. "This garden isn't just about flowers or trees, it's about people, about how we grow, how we heal, and how we choose to care for one another." She paused, letting her words settle. A year ago, this was a place of conflict, but look at it now. It's a place of connection, of hope, and that's because of each of you. You've shown that no matter how deep the wounds, healing is always possible. Josh stood then, clearing his throat. Miss Clara, he said, his voice filled with emotion. I think I speak for a lot of us when I say thank you for your patience, your strength, and for believing in us, even when we didn't deserve it. Maggie stepped forward next, holding up her sketchbook. I'm working on a project for school, she said, her cheeks flushed. It's about resilience and community, and I wanted to include this garden. It's changed so much, and so have we. The group clapped, and Clara felt her heart swell. Thank you, Maggie, she said softly. That means more to me than you know. As the evening continued, Clara moved through the garden, speaking with each person who had gathered. She saw Ray Wilson standing near the edge, his hands shoved into his pockets. Their eyes met, and Clara nodded, a gesture of understanding and acceptance. Slowly, Ray approached, holding a small sapling in his hands. I thought this might fit, he said gruffly, echoing his words from months earlier. But this time, his voice carried something else. Humility. Clara took the sapling, her hands steady as she studied it. It'll grow strong here, she replied, just like everything else. Together, they planted the sapling near the edge of the garden, a quiet act of redemption and renewal. As Clara pressed the soil around its roots, she looked up at Ray. It's never too late to grow, she said gently. Ray nodded, his gaze fixed on the sapling. I'm starting to see that. The gathering lasted well into the evening, the garden illuminated by the soft glow of string lights that Caleb had helped install. Clara watched as neighbors laughed, shared stories, and forged connections. The sight filled her with a profound sense of peace. As the crowd began to disperse, Maggie lingered near the tree, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. She turned to Clara, her eyes bright with gratitude. Thank you, Miss Clara, she said, for everything. Clara placed a hand on Maggie's shoulder, her touch light but steady. It wasn't just me, Maggie. It was all of us. Maggie nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. Even so, you showed us how to start. When the last of the neighbors had gone, Clara stood alone in her garden, the night quiet and still around her. She looked at the tree, its branches stretching toward the stars, and felt a deep sense of contentment. The garden was more than a sanctuary now. It was a legacy. A garden grows stronger with care, Clara whispered, her voice carrying on the breeze. And so do we. As she turned to head inside, the moonlight cast a gentle glow over the garden, illuminating the flowers, the tree, and the small sapling that Ray had planted. It was a symbol of new beginnings, of the roots they had all grown together.